Well, hello, 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 all you lovely people. Wait a second. Are those tears in your eyes? Tears of sadness? Tears of joy? Maybe we all just have Stockholm syndrome at this point. Anyhow, yes, this is it. This is the last unit of, sorry, well, the last unit too, the last module of the last unit of the course. Can you believe it? I can't believe it. Yay. But of course, that does also mean that your final unit exam is due this weekend. And so, as usual, I will post a short video along with the exam when I do that. So, more on that later. But wow, we've come a long way, baby. We started back in unit 1 of the course. You remember back then? Oh my gosh, the world was a different place. We had that quote from Socrates, right, about how ethics is about life, about living a life, about us living together. And this whole idea we see in Socrates then is about how ethics is inescapable, just as like you can't escape living. Well, I mean, not in good ways. So yeah, you can't escape life. You can't escape ethics, since ethics is about how you ought to live your life. Yeah. And we also saw that ethics is very personal. It's about what you ought to do. And recall, this is the practical of practical questions. What ought I do? And we also saw how this makes ethics normative, right? Because we're not doing something descriptive like psychology. We're doing something normative about how we ought to behave, making value judgments concerning right and wrong action, good and bad, and so on. Again, all these value judgments is what we've been doing here all semester now. And also back in Unit 1, we introduced the idea of moral reasoning. Oh, we haven't thought about this in a while. Remember, the idea of moral reasoning is where the right thing to do has the best reasons for doing it. Yeah, and you might recall, look, it just means, look, we're prepared to offer other people reasons for why we think what's right or what's wrong. And similarly, we demand reasons from other people when they're telling you what's right and wrong or what you should be doing. Yeah, we demand reasons from them as well. And as I kind of said back then in Unit 1, moral reasoning is the way, equals reason with each other, persuade each other, try to organize ourselves together in some fashion, not through force, fraud, trickery, and other devious things. No, we try to reason with each other. That's the fundamental human capacity. And we've seen this idea, of course, of moral reasoning spread throughout this whole course, becoming the idea of, living a structured life and making plans and all that. And then in the second unit of the course, right, we talked about on what is morality grounded, and we saw a lot of different possibilities there. This was our journey into meta-ethics. Meta-ethics, I haven't talked about that in a while either. And I recall meta-ethics focuses on analyzing what claims in ethics mean and how do we justify such claims. And yeah, we saw a bunch of different ways to justify our claims in morality, right? We saw cultural relativism, ground morality on cultural acceptance. We saw ethical subjectivism, ground morality on individual acceptance. We also saw divine command theory and the theory of natural law, which is trying to ground morality somehow into God. But recall for me as the instructor, in this class, as I just suggested, we focus primarily back to moral reasoning itself. And I just gave it a fancy name, right? This moral cognitivism was where we just say morality is grounded on the best reasons and the best arguments for doing or not doing something. And yeah, and then after that, the rest of the course, right, units 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're all about normative ethics, right? We've been doing this for so long now. Normative ethics involves the statement and defense of basic moral principles. And so in Unit 3, we saw the debate between Ayn Rand and her ethical egoism, and then Jeremy Bentham and his classical utilitarianism about, whether or not the interests of others matter, a very interesting and important debate. And then in Unit 4, we introduced the deliberative utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, which tried to give us a more robust kind of form of utilitarianism, though, of course, as we saw, there was utilitarianism of all classical or deliberative has problems, especially when it comes to, trying to ground or understand justice and understand rights. We saw some weaknesses there. Because at the end of the day, it was all about, the greater good. The greater good. Oh, there it is. But that dissatisfaction with the greater good. The greater good. Really? That led us to this idea of deontology, recall, where we saw there were constraints on how we might act. And this led us to a concern for what we might understand as the common good, something in common we all have with each other that grounds rights more firmly, more fundamentally. And then we explored deontology more fully in Unit 5 of the class, especially by looking at, good old Immanuel Kant, right? A very difficult author. But his ideas, though, are very powerful when it comes to the nature of our dignity and our autonomy. Autonomy is so important, this fundamental capacity, that allows us to make plans and lead a structured life. We see most beautifully, I think, in Kant. And then in the last unit we just finished up, we're finishing up, I guess now, unit number 6, right, is where we saw some dissatisfaction with universal rules and principles. And that's where we get something like an ethics of care or Aristotle's ethics of excellence. And so, a whole lot of normative ethics this semester and a lot of different basic moral principles to consider, whether that's the principle of utility from, the utilitarians of Bentham and John Stuart Mill, or the formulas of universal law and the formula of humanity from Immanuel Kant. And then, of course, the more situational and diverse morality that we saw, say, coming from Aristotle's account of character and the intellect that we just finished up. Now, along the way, of course, we've also done a lot of applied ethics. Recall applied ethics now. Applied ethics has us ask questions about what should be done in this specific case or on this specific issue. And so, we've talked about a few different areas. We talked about the opioid crisis. We've talked about women in leadership. We talked about torture. We just talked about the terrorists on 9/11. Are they courageous? Aristotle, of course, says no. And of course, this is during applied ethics is when we met our good friend Peter Singer about, world poverty and how we treat animals. And he was pretty demanding. We saw on that we must give a lot to help those in poverty. And we also must become vegetarian and treat animals much better. So we've covered a lot of material in this class. And I mean, look, it's awesome. I mean, it's well done. It's no small thing you guys have done here. And I hope you realize that. I hope you feel that this is a big deal what you guys did here. And I'm really proud of you for making it this far, for watching this right now. I mean, it's amazing. So, I mean, seriously, well done. I mean, I wish I could express this in a classroom or, where you can actually see. I really do. I'm so happy with you all. Anyhow, in this last module, I want to go back to where we started this course, back to Socrates, back to this idea that he says that we're doing, no small thing. We're talking about how we ought to live. That is important. And we'll do this by looking at two things written by Plato. The first is this allegory of the cave. This allegory of the cave is probably literally the most famous thing Plato ever wrote. I mean, some of you might have read it in high school. That's when I first read it, actually, was I think junior year of high school is when I read this allegory of the cave for English class, right? And those of you studying education, I think you might already know this allegory of the cave as well, because it provides a very powerful metaphor for understanding education and the role of the teacher and the instructor. So education folks, I think you can find this very inspiring as well, that allegory of the cave. And the second thing we'll be looking at from Plato is Socrates' defense during his trial. Because as you might remember back when we read the Euthyphro, that was a long time ago, we read the Euthyphro when we were talking about divine command theory way back in unit number 2. And remember, Euthyphro is talking to Socrates there outside of the courthouse just before Socrates is going on trial. Because recall, the real life Socrates was charged with impiety and the corruption of the youths. And so in any case, we can talk about what Socrates said during that trial, his speech in his defense. And by the way, most historians do agree that this speech is of course, Plato's a poet as well as a philosopher. And so I'm sure Plato is taking some dramatic license here, but most historians think this is fairly accurate in terms of the kind of spirit and what Socrates probably actually said during his trial. So anyhow, before we go into all of that, first I'm going to show you a video by Alex Gendler where he presents Plato's allegory of the cave. Second, I will use Socrates' speech in the Apology to explain how it is that Socrates ended up leaving the cave. Third, I'll continue on with Socrates' speech in the Apology to answer the question, why return? Why return to the cave? Fourth, and finally, I'll conclude by returning to this idea that ethics is inescapable. So there it all is, man. There's your men and women, ladies and gents, everyone. There it is. That's your final module right there. Now, as usual, before we dive into all that, of course, let's take a quick break. And then when you come back, you can go over and watch Alex Gendler's video on the allegory of the cave. Now, as always, be good for your substitute teacher. Be good for Mr. Gendler. And then come back here and we can start talking about all that stuff.